The subcommittee will come to order. Thank you so much for your patience. As a person who lost her native homeland, Cuba, to communism, where we don't have elections, I always say that it's wonderful to get interrupted by elections and by votes. So I never complain, but that's why we're so late in getting started. Thank you to the witnesses for your patience and to the audience members as well. Ranking Member Ted Deutsch was going to be here to at least give his opening remarks. He has a conflicting committee scheduled at the same time, but because of the timing with the earlier votes at 1:30, he's now going to not be able to come. But I don't know, I think that we've glammed it up by having Mr. Boyle sit in for Mr. Deutsch. Don't tell him that, okay? Especially Deutschette if she's around. We will give our opening statements, and then we will recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses. Thanks for your patience. Without objection, your prepared statements will be made a part of the record. Members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. It has now been over 8 months since former Secretary of State Tillerson outlined the administration's strategy in Syria, and over 4 months since Secretary Pompeo outlined the administration's strategy for Iran, a big piece of which included the complete withdrawal from Syria of all forces under Iranian command. Yet, despite some recent and welcome changes in the administration's approach to Syria, there's still more questions than answers about exactly what we hope to achieve and how we plan on achieving those goals. So this hearing is part 1 of 2, and it's designed to allow our members to hear from 3 expert witnesses, all of whom will provide their perspectives on recent events, as well as their recommendations going forward. The second part, which we hope to reschedule with the State Department and USAID soon, will allow members to hear directly from the administration and perform our necessary oversight role. As you know, we did have the State Department witness scheduled, but then votes were canceled, so we had to scrap that hearing. 2 weeks ago, we were on the precipice of a large-scale humanitarian disaster in Idlib province, a disaster potentially worse, as hard as it is to imagine, than anything Syria had seen before. And while that disaster has been averted for now through a Russian-Turkish agreement for a demilitarized zone, there's no telling exactly how long that will hold. I look forward to our witnesses' perspective on this agreement, what they see holding it together, what factors may cause it to fall apart. More broadly, I'm hoping to hear what you believe the U.S. role should be, not just in Idlib, but Syria as a whole. The State Department's new Special Representative for Syria Engagement, former U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, Jim Jeffrey, has said that the United States is going to take a more active approach and that we are potentially entering a new phase, as he called it, with forces from the United States, Israel, Russia, Iran, and Turkey facing each other. Many people have been describing Syria as the new great game after British and Russian competition over Central Asia in the 19th century. While today's great power rivalry in Syria has many of the same players, it is no less tragic, with at least 500,000 killed, likely many more, millions of refugees, untold crimes, hardships against the people of Syria. And when you add China to the equation, which has reportedly offered the Assad regime both military cooperation and reconstruction assistance, well, you have every great power, as well as the lesser ones, trying to carve out a role in Syria. Yesterday, in a hearing of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, Assistant Secretary for Defense Robert Karam described U.S. strategy in Syria this way, quote, "The United States also seeks a peaceful resolution to the multifaceted conflict in Syria in a manner that protects U.S. interests, preserves a favorable regional balance of power, protects our allies and partners, and alleviates suffering." No doubt these objectives are noble and they are correct, but what they are not is a strategy. How does the United States plan to achieve a peaceful resolution to the conflict? What is a favorable regional balance of power with respect to Syria? And how do we protect our allies and partners and alleviate suffering? The administration owes the American people clear answers to these questions, especially when we still have U.S. men and women in Syria and in harm's way. The road ahead will not get any easier. As National Security Advisor John Bolton said this week, Russia's planned sale of S-300 air defense systems to the Assad regime represents what he called a significant escalation. And any hope that Russia would pressure Assad into requesting Iran's withdrawal, always a long shot, appears abandoned. These countries are digging into Syria, preparing for the long haul, and the implications for U.S. interests and those of our partners are still coming into focus. I'm looking forward to hearing from you exactly how you see Syria playing out in the months and years ahead, as well as hearing any recommendations you have for giving the United States the best chance of these noble goals that we seek. And with that, I'm very pleased to yield to the ranking member for today's hearing, Mr. Boyle of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, and Madam Chair, regarding your earlier comments about Mr. Deutsch, I can't say I necessarily agree, but you are known to be very wise, so I'll just leave it at that. Thank you, and I'm very glad to have this hearing. U.S. policy towards Syria is difficult for everyone to address. It was for the Obama administration, and it is now for the Trump administration. More than 7 years into this conflict, clarity is needed now more than ever, not more fog. The Trump administration must present to Congress, finally, a comprehensive strategy for Syria. So far, it is not, and the President continues to undercut his administration with conflicting statements. What started as peaceful protests in March 2011 is now an international conflict. I was recently on television, and I actually called it a mini world war, when you consider just how many of the world's major actors are participating in this conflict. One of those, Vladimir Putin, continues to prop up the Assad regime with also the support of Iran. As a result of the war, more than 500,000 civilians have been killed. That number, by the way, is badly out of date. We still don't know really what the actual number is. And we do know that more than 11 million people have been displaced, 6.5 million Syrians internally, and more than 5 million have been forced to flee the country, destabilizing not just to Syria, but also to many European countries. Yet, despite this, Assad continues to slaughter his people and destroy their cities. Idlib is currently the last stronghold for the Syrian opposition. Idlib hosts an estimated 3 million civilians, most of whom are displaced from other regions of Syria. While an immediate offensive by the regime appears for the moment to be on hold, the question of Assad's future use of chemical weapons and his other atrocious tactics hangs heavy on the international community. The administration has threatened to respond, quote, swiftly and appropriately if Assad again uses chemical weapons. The threat once again makes us scratch our heads. Isn't this where we were in April of 2017 and again in April of this year? What's changed? What kind of response is the administration considering? In September, the UN stated that a mass assault on Idlib could result in, and I quote, the biggest humanitarian catastrophe we've seen for decades, certainly the biggest in the 21st century. The UN has described conditions for civilians in Idlib as, quote, dire, and stated, quote, conflicting parties must cease and refrain from future use of indiscriminate weapons or tactics to target thousands of fighters interspersed among the 3 million civilians, including 1 million children. Compounding the situation in Idlib is the administration's decision to reprogram more than $200 million for stabilization assistance for Syria. This funding includes services for water and electricity, independent media, and governance projects. These programs reached millions of people and helped bolster civilian efforts to build freedom, democracy, and resiliency against violent ideology. I strongly oppose this decision. This funding is essential to the long-term security of the United States and our regional allies. As we enter the final stage in our fight against ISIS, it is imperative that we counter radicalization. The humanitarian crisis also poses significant questions for the U.S. and our regional allies. As the UNHCR High Commissioner Grandi said, Syria is the biggest humanitarian and refugee crisis of our time. It is a continuing case of suffering for millions, which should be garnering a groundswell of support around the world. But the UN's humanitarian pleas hit deaf ears, particularly from this administration, which slashed refugee admission levels to the United States. Seizing on this fatigue, the Assad regime seeks the prompt return of refugees. Humanitarian advocates argue the situation on the ground is far from being safe enough for refugees to return. The international community must take into account these prevailing difficult conditions and potential political persecutions. So with the weight of these issues to be addressed and enormous, the question is, what can we do? In Congress yesterday, I'm pleased the Senate Foreign Relations Committee marked up H.R. 1677, Syria Civilian Protect Act of 2017, which is critical for investigating war crimes and holding the Assad regime accountable. I encourage my Senate colleagues to pass this legislation as soon as possible. But this bill really is only a drop in the bucket. There are no easy answers in Syria, but that doesn't mean we can throw up our hands and think America first and go home. Our decisions now will impact Americans in the future. U.S. leadership and engagement in Syria is needed now more than ever. So I look forward to today's panel that's here with us to discuss this critical issue. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes himself for an opening statement. I'll just keep it very brief. We all know the terrible situation in Syria, and I feel like, for the whole time I've been in Congress, I've been repeating myself on the tragedy, and the numbers have gotten bigger, the tragedy has gotten worse, and inaction has continued. I give this administration a lot of credit for making a very strong stand in Idlib, and talking about the consequences in no uncertain terms. I give this administration a lot of credit for finally enforcing red lines against the use of chemical weapons, which has never been accepted on the battlefield since World War I until 2013 without consequence, which I think was a massive mistake, and that's not to point fingers in the past, but to learn from it and to learn what the United States can do that both hurts and helps. I would love to see over Syria a no-fly zone. I'd love to see a negotiated solution that does not include Russia, a Russian presence, and definitely not an Iranian presence in Syria. But we know that we find ourselves in a very tough situation. So I look more forward to hearing from the witnesses than anything today. And with that, I'll yield back my time and recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder, for a minute.
Thank you, and I want to thank the subcommittee for having this hearing today, this critical hearing. This crisis is in its 7th year, and it becomes ever more devastating, ever more concerning, and as the witnesses, having read your submitted testimony, will touch on that the hard part still may lie ahead of us, not behind us. But I think the United States' interests in Syria can be put into 3 buckets: humanitarian, security, and strategic. And as Mr. Harris, you were going to elucidate, I assume from your submitted testimony, there's an incoherence in the U.S. approach that has sent mixed signals that has left the situation increasingly problematic. We need from the United States a coherent vision for the future of Syria. We need, as the United States, to articulate specific goals we're seeking to achieve, and we need to develop a very concrete and specific strategy for achieving those goals. I think it's imperative that Congress be engaged in this discussion and that Congress take action as we continue to look forward. This hearing is an important chance for the members of Congress to hear your perspective. I look forward to what you are going to share with us today, and again, thank you for taking the time to be here.
Gentleman yields back. I want to, again, welcome our witnesses for being here today. I'll introduce each of you, and then we'll turn to you each to give your 5-minute opening remarks and then questions. First, we're delighted to welcome Ms. Haneen Gadar, the inaugural Friedman Visiting Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Ms. Gadar was a managing editor of Now, the Lebanese-based news organization, and is a regular contributor to magazine and newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. Previously, she was a non-resident fellow at the Rafik Hariri Center at the Atlantic Council and a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Thank you so much for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. Next, we're also delighted to welcome Mr. Nicholas Harris, a fellow at the Center for New American Security and senior analyst at the Jamestown Foundation. Prior to joining CNAS, he joined as research associate at the National Defense University. Mr. Harris is a former National Security Education Program David L. Boren Fellow. Thank you for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. And lastly, we're delighted to welcome back Ms. Mona Yabukina. Okay, close. Senior Advisor for Syria, Middle East, and North Africa for the United States Institute of Peace. Previously, she served as Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Middle East Bureau at USAID and as North African Analyst in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department. Thank you so much for being here as well, and we look forward to your testimony. And for all your names I messed up, I apologize. But first, for 5 minutes, Ms. Gadar, if you'd like to give your opening testimony.
Chairman, ranking member, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting me to testify today. In the past 8 years, Iran and its proxies have been threatening U.S. interests in Syria and paving the way for the resurgence of Sunni jihadism. In my written testimony, I have gone into details of how Iran has entrenched itself in Syria and what the U.S. can do to counter its hegemony. But for the sake of brevity, I will be summarizing my written statement. Iran has 5 main goals in Syria: protect the Assad regime, increase its presence and influence in Syria, maintain Syria as the vital bridge between Iraq and Lebanon, get closer to the Golan Heights to create another potential front against Israel. And Iran used 4 tactical objectives to achieve these goals. 1, secure the Lebanese-Syrian border to ensure the flow of weapons from Syria to Lebanon. 2, create a parallel military structure independent from the state's army, using the successful model of Hezbollah in Lebanon. 3, protect Damascus as the regime's capital via systematic demographic changes. Sunni communities were pushed out, to Idlib, for example, and were often replaced with pro-regime groups. Assad regime issued a new law number 10 to legalize these changes. 4, create religious centers and schools and buy up Syrian lands. However, these achievements are still fragile, and the United States could use Iran's weaknesses to push back. Many of these challenges are reflected in the evolution of its most prestigious proxy, Hezbollah. Hezbollah's training and leading all Iran-backed Shia militias. Its weapons arsenal grew and developed, and their fighting force have swelled, but this growth came with many challenges. Hezbollah has lost many of its high-ranking commanders and well-trained fighters. Hezbollah's extensive military operations have forced the group to make budget shifts, thereby limiting the group's ability to provide social services to its constituents. Hezbollah's involvement in a sectarian conflict has prompted a loss in broad Arab backing. Hezbollah's fighting force has actually changed. The new fighter is mostly there for the financial rewards and therefore is less disciplined, less trained, less ideological, and less religious. He is, however, much more sectarian. These challenges provide a number of opportunities. Based on my long-term research, I believe creating economic alternatives for young Shia men and women could be very effective, while simultaneously limiting Hezbollah's military role in Syria and the region. In South Syria, the current presence of Syrian forces close to the Golan Heights would serve as a conduit for Hezbollah and other militias to quietly redeploy anytime they like. Israel is currently capable of protecting its border, but when Iran decides to launch a full-fledged war, the situation will become complicated. It is better to avoid such a war and find an alternative to prohibit Iran from infiltrating the south. As for the land bridge that connects Tehran to Beirut, it establishes an uninterrupted Iranian presence in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, which would add fire to the radical anti-Shia narrative espoused by the Islamic State. The bridge is very vulnerable in places where Sunni tribes are present, so working with these tribes can help counter Iran. In addition, the US can do the following to contain Iran. 1, expose the Assad regime. In addition to killing for more than 400,000 Syrians and using chemical weapons against his own people, Assad is only helping Iran and Russia grow their influence in the region. Therefore, maintaining the line that Assad has to go is important, but also focusing the narrative on Assad's war crimes and his dependence on Iran is vital. 2, counter demographic changes. The United States can work with Europeans and other refugees host countries to ensure that refugees are allowed to return to their hometowns, maintain their land and properties, and guaranteed safety along the way, and are not forced into mandatory conscription into Assad's army. 3, deepen work with local allies. If the United States maintained its presence, boosted coordination with local and regional partners, and increased its military footprint where Iran is mostly invested, this would fill a critical vacuum and deny Iran opportunities to expand. From the perspective of regional actors, American consistency and predictability are crucial. This means defining, communicating, and sticking to specific commitments. Finally, go after Hezbollah's Lebanese allies. Hezbollah's economy is cash-based, and sanctions will not significantly affect it. However, it could be effective to sanction Hezbollah's Lebanese allies who assist the organization in leading its regional wars from Lebanon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Harris.
Madam Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss.
Mr. Harris, could you put your microphone just a little closer to your mouth? Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to discuss U.S. policy towards Syria today. Since the United States began combat operations against ISIS in September 2014, it has amassed a zone of control that is nearly 1/3 of Syria's territory. With this zone, we have control or strong influence over the 4 major resources that are essential to stabilizing Syria: water, oil, arable land, and electricity generation. The fact is that through our zone of control, we are as strong or as weak as we choose to be to influence the endgame in Syria. The administration states that U.S. forces will remain in Syria indefinitely to oversee a successful stabilization mission in post-ISIS areas. Withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria is also being tied to irreversible progress on the implementation of the Geneva process, which means a post-war government that has transitioned from Assad and when Iran and its proxy forces have left Syria. In effect, the Trump administration is saying that it is our policy to remain in Syria indefinitely until there is both regime change in Damascus and Iran has been forced from Syria. Our significant zone of control in Syria and the administration's Syria policy goals will be challenged by Assad's alliance, which includes Russia and Iran, and also by Turkey. In 2018, Bashar al-Assad, with Russia and Iran's help, has been consolidating his control over most of western Syria. His major accomplishment was the capture of all territory in southwest Syria, bordering Israel and Jordan. Israel and Jordan relinquished their zones of control in southwest Syria to Russia as a result of the collapse of the U.S.-negotiated Southwest De-Escalation Zone, which the United States ultimately decided not to defend. These events further established Russia as the key foreign actor responsible for stabilizing western Syria. Assad's victories in 2018 have also protected Iran's entrenchment in western Syria. From its position in western Syria, Iran and its proxies have the potential to sustain missile volleys deep into Israel, which could force an Israeli invasion all the way to Damascus, which would likely spark a regional war. For the time being, Russia and Iran are generally in sync with their efforts in Syria. In response to Russia and Iran, and faced with its current reality of not being present in western Syria in a meaningful way, the United States is now pursuing a strategy of using sanctions, an indefinite military presence, and a refusal to support international reconstruction assistance for the Assad government, all designed to pressure Russia to force Assad's departure and the withdrawal of Iran. While this strategy might work, the process of putting enough pressure on Russia to remove Assad and to get Iran and its proxies out of Syria will likely take years, perhaps even decades. That reality should be stated clearly to the American people by the administration. And Congress should carefully consider whether the United States should remain in Syria for many more years or decades in order to pursue an end-state goal that may not be achievable. The administration might eventually achieve its goals in Syria with a grand bargain with Turkey. However, striking a grand bargain with Turkey should come on our terms, because without the strong support of the Trump administration, Turkey would not have been able to stand its ground against Russia and Iran and prevent Idlib from becoming a humanitarian nightmare. We have an interest in removing al-Qaeda and similar groups from Idlib, which can only be accomplished by working with Turkey. But there's no easy path for the United States and Turkey to uproot al-Qaeda and similar organizations from Idlib, because these organizations include a significant number of local Syrian fighters and are actively involved in the security and governance of Idlib. Turkey will need our support to do that, but we should not provide the support at the expense of our best partners in Syria, the multi-ethnic, heroic Syrian Democratic Forces Coalition, which is what Erdogan wants us to do. If Erdogan got his wish, that would directly undermine the U.S. stabilization mission in Syria, which could be a boon for ISIS. In conclusion, our investment in almost 1/3 of Syria means that we have a stake in the outcome of the war. We should strive for a post-conflict Syria that is stable and that is not a source of threats to the United States or its partners and allies. We should also take every opportunity to achieve a political settlement in Syria that protects the interests of our local partners. However, we should also be honest with the American people. The United States is not prepared to use military force against Assad and his Iranian allies. It could take years, perhaps even decades, to force Assad out of power and remove Iran from Syria. Thank you, and I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much. Ms. Yakubian?
Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Boyle, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on U.S. policy towards Syria. I'm currently a senior advisor on Syria, the Middle East, and North Africa at the U.S. Institute of Peace, although my interest in Syria dates to 1985 when I was a Fulbright student based in Damascus. I'd like to note that the views I express today are my own and not necessarily those of USIP. Today's hearing is particularly timely. Syria's brutal conflict, now in its 8th year, is entering its most dangerous phase, posing a significant challenge to U.S. strategic interests. Two key developments account for this precarious time in Syria. First, the Syrian civil war is entering a messy and protracted endgame. Unfortunately, the regime of Bashar al-Assad, backed by the critical support of Russia and Iran, is likely to prevail. Assad's reliance on external patrons, especially Iran, threatens to upend the regional power balance. Tehran has provided unprecedented military support to the Syrian regime. Iran's military entrenchment in Syria threatens Israel's security as well as the regional order. The old rules of the game, establishing strategic deterrence between Israel and Syria, no longer apply. Neither Israel nor Iran appears to be interested in an all-out war, but they may be on a dangerous collision course. Second, as the military campaign against ISIS enters its final phase, new conflicts and fault lines are emerging. Most urgently, conflict between Turkey and the Syrian Kurds looms large, with the potential for broader destabilization. Potential hostilities between the U.S. and Russia pose a less immediate but more significant threat. As the Assad regime seeks to expand its control further east, the possibility of clashes between Russia and its proxies and the United States is likely to increase. Finally, while ISIS has been ousted from much of Syria, the extremist movement could morph into a potent insurgency. ISIS has retained its capabilities, most notably its ability to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. Given these dangerous developments, the Trump administration's renewed focus on Syria is timely and important. While Syria poses significant challenges, the United States has policy options to shape an outcome more favorable to key U.S. objectives in Syria. These include the enduring defeat of ISIS, curbing Iranian influence, and shaping a political settlement to the conflict. I recommend adopting a 3D approach to Syria that leverages core elements of U.S. power, defense, diplomacy, and development to pursue U.S. objectives in Syria. In my written testimony, I developed this strategy through 3 interrelated and mutually reinforcing baskets of policy options. The defense basket focuses on maintaining the 2,000-plus U.S. Special Operations Force presence in Syria as a foundational element of the strategy. The benefits of the U.S. military presence in Syria are significant and include liberating ISIS-held areas, training local hold forces, and providing an important source of leverage that enhances U.S. influence in Syria. The diplomatic basket emphasizes the need to rejuvenate U.S. regional diplomacy in 3 areas: improving ties with Turkey, engaging Israel, Jordan, and Russia to prevent unintended escalation between Israel and Iran, and deepening engagement with our European allies. The development basket highlights the importance of restoring U.S. stabilization assistance, which is critical to ISIS' enduring defeat. Encouraging Gulf allies and others to contribute to these efforts is important and to be commended, but there is no substitute for U.S. leadership anchored by concrete commitments on the ground. I'd like to conclude with an over-the-horizon perspective on Syria. Unfortunately, Syria could be an important harbinger of future Middle East conflicts. 3 trends embodied by the Syrian conflict demand greater understanding in order to anticipate and better prepare for future conflicts in the region. First, the rise of ISIS, a new generation of jihadists with a demonstrated capacity to innovate and adapt. Second, battlefield tactics that routinely transgress all laws of armed conflict, including the use of chemical weapons. And third, massive levels of civilian displacement that have overwhelmed the humanitarian assistance infrastructure and imperiled neighboring refugee-hosting countries. The Syrian tragedy will resonate for generations to come. It's essential to seize the opportunity to develop effective policy responses to the current conflict, as well as more forward-leaning strategies for addressing future challenges. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Excellent, excellent testimony. I'm going to ask a question of you, Ms. Goddard, and Dr. Harris, and I hope I'm not doing a great disservice to your names. Mine is a very difficult name. I don't know how to pronounce mine either. But Ms. Goddard?
I'm sorry, but isn't it Ros-Lehtinen?
I don't know. Sometimes I go Lehtinen. I don't. It's Finnish. Go figure.
By the way, did you know?
I did know.
I worked in the. All right, well.
Oh, but did you know about Dana working in the White House? And anyway, this is a private, silly joke we've got going.
Madam Chair,
Yes, sir.
if I could just say, it's funny every time.
It's
So,
fine. It never gets old.
for anybody who knows
We are
what the heck they're talking
Old
about.
guys doing the same old
Wait a
cat
minute.
skills routine. Thank you. But in your testimony, you were highlighting Iran's efforts to change Syria's demography, and you highlighted that Iran is ethnically and religiously cleansing Sunni communities, replacing them with pro-Assad Shia and Alawite groups. This is so alarming. You recommend that the United States work with our partners to ensure that refugees return to their properties and defend them from being conscripted into Assad's army. Can you tell us more about what Iran's objectives are with this demographic change? And related to that, how can we ensure that refugees that are first able to return safely to their homes? We all, I'm sure, want to go back home, but how safe is it for them? And second, resilient enough so that they aren't susceptible to Iran and Assad's influence? Thank you, ma'am.
All right. Thank you. This is a very, very important question. Thank you for asking me to elaborate. I'd love to. The demographic changes are actually happening in certain areas in Syria, and in areas that actually the useful Syria, what I call useful Syria, what Iran really is trying to control, it's the land corridor, basically that connects the Alawite coast to the Lebanese border and to the Iraqi border. So this corridor, according to Iran, has to be protected. And because they need to protect it from inside, the communities who live along this corridor in the towns and villages that are located in this corridor have to be demographically changed. So most of the Syrians, the Sunni communities, were pushed out to Lebanon from Homs and the suburbs of Damascus, and a lot of them were moved to Idlib. So the refugees we see in Idlib, internally displaced refugees we see today in Idlib, are mostly coming from this land corridor. So they used a strategy that relied on besieging, hunger, and forcing people basically to make deals and leave these towns. They sent them to Idlib in Lebanon, and today they brought in a lot of families of the fighters that they have brought in from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Lebanon. They are giving them, according to this new law, law number 10, that basically legalize these demographic changes. They give the refugees only 30 days in order to claim their property in person, otherwise they take it, and they can give it to the new families. The idea behind this is not only to protect Damascus, but also to make sure that this corridor within Syria, their useful Syria, is protected. I hope this answers the demographic changes part. Sorry, what was
now? How do they reach the person supposedly to let them know that they have 30 days?
They just issued the law.
Yeah, I mean, there's
Good luck. Yeah,
that's
if
right.
you know about it, you know about it. If you don't know about
anywhere.
it, yeah, exactly. So some people knew, some people didn't. Well,
and then I asked,
in terms of the safe return of the refugees,
right.
I'll give you just an example of the case of the refugees in Lebanon and the Lebanese government, which is today more and more becoming pro-Hezbollah. They're trying to push the refugees out. Some of them actually went. Some of them were forced to join the Assad army. The act of forcing them out is not humanitarian. So far, the refugees in Lebanon have been denied actually the status of refugees. This policy of the government in Lebanon, which is basically Hezbollah's policy, is to make sure that they pushed out without guaranteeing anything to them. So they do not want to go that way. They want to go their homes, but they're not going to their homes. They're going to Idlib. Those who left, they were pushed to Idlib. And this is what we're seeing today in Idlib, more and more pressure on the refugees who are actually forced to leave places like Lebanon. So that's what I'm saying is that the Lebanese government, the Lebanese army, takes a lot of money from the US. Right, for the in terms of equipment, there's a lot of leverage that can be used in order to force the Lebanese government to make sure that the refugees are not going to be forced to go to Syria.
But we have leverage because we give a lot of money to the Lebanese forces.
Exactly, you do have leverage. You can use it in order to make sure, at least like one of the ways you can use it is to force the Lebanese government not to force the refugees out.
Not to force them out.
That way. That way.
Thank you so much. You are such an expert in this.
Thank you.
Mr. Harris, you highlighted the risky nature of the administration's apparent policy of pressuring Russia to help achieve our stabilization goals in Western Syria. And I had said in my opening statement that John Bolton, National Security Advisor, recently called Russia's promised sale of S-300s to Assad a significant escalation. Does it seem to you that the administration is starting to acknowledge that Russia will indeed not be a useful partner for us in Russia? And even if we could pressure Russia to help us, what do you see as the pressure points? What is our leverage? We talk about where we have leverage with the Lebanese forces. What do we do with Russia? And if we aren't able to successfully pressure Moscow, and I don't know how we could ever do that, what alternatives are there? Thank you, and take your time.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I do believe that the administration is cognizant of the challenge that comes from asking Russia to apply pressure on Assad and Iran. Fundamentally, the challenge is that Russia is in a good position. Its military installations, the air base at Hammameim and Latakia in coastal western Syria has been expanded. It's turned Hammameim base into a hub of its future operations in the wider Middle East and North Africa, and that'll present a strategic challenge to the United States. And it's expanded its Cold War-era naval port that it had in Tartus, also in coastal western Syria. Russia is also embedded in reforming Assad's security forces, and the major challenge for Russia is to normalize Assad. And that will be its challenge, and the longer that it takes for Russia to normalize Assad and to try to open the taps for international reconstruction assistance, the more pressure Russia could potentially feel. And that is a potential way to unlock Russia's agreement to transition from Assad. The challenge then is, can you get Russia to agree to remove enough of Assad's security and intelligence regime to make a meaningful democratic Syria in post-conflict that respects human rights and is willing to join the family of nations? And that's an open question. And the second challenge is, does Russia have an incentive to remove Iran and its proxies from Syria? And my understanding of how the administration policy is unfolding is that in lieu of waiting for Russia, a maximum pressure strategy on Iran could potentially weaken its position in Syria over time because of the cost of maintaining its presence there. But I would emphasize that both trying to put pressure on Russia and trying to put pressure on Iran will take time. And the question is, will that time be spent productively by the United States to stabilize the area of Syria that we control?
And Ms. Jacobian, do you have anything to add to what we had just discussed? Feel free to comment.
Just a quick point. I would very much agree with Nick's analysis, and I think in particular, if we are trying to understand what are the points of leverage with Russia, which is an excellent question, I do think this desire to eventually extricate itself in terms of reaching some sort of internationally blessed political settlement is important. And I would point to the recent demilitarization zone that was negotiated with Turkey as an important data point in this. I certainly concur with the skepticism in terms of how long this will last, but the fact that at the last minute the Russians did, in fact, I think, yield to what it saw as international pressure from the international community writ large, that the international community would not tolerate the blatant and widespread massacre, quite frankly, of Syrian civilians living in this zone, is evidence that Russia is trying to preserve some sort of negotiation, some sort of way to have some kind of longer-term political settlement to the conflict. That's where I think our leverage lies. And I would also agree that our presence on the ground is another important source of leverage. It indicates real U.S. skin in the game. It can translate into leverage at the negotiating table. It is, as Nick noted, it's at least 25% of Syrian territory, and it's important Syrian territory. It has oil and gas resources, water resources, valuable agricultural land. I think this is an important source of leverage that we need to explore and understand better how we can bring that to the negotiating table and how we can actually help influence the trajectory in Syria. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you so much. Really excellent witness testimony. And I'm going to turn to Mr. Boyle and ask Mr. Shabbat if he could do me a favor and chair for a little while. I have to return 2 phone calls. I sincerely apologize. You'll be in better hands. And Mr. Boyle is recognized.
Thank you. So actually, I was going to get into the question of the issue of what leverage, if any, we have over Moscow. I found your comments encouraging in a situation that generally is not encouraging. One challenge about talking about this is that there are so many different areas that we could go down in a short period of time. I'm not going to use my time talking about what we could have and should have been doing over the last 7 years. That's instructive to learn from and to apply to conflicts moving forward, but perhaps better to think now of what we can do. Just one last point, though, having said I'm not going to talk about the last 7 years, one point I do want to bring up for those who think that this is an isolated Syria issue. This link, I have not heard this link drawn by anyone except for me. The Syrian, what was the Syrian civil war, now I think it's more accurate to just say the Syrian war because there's so many players there, has had such a destabilizing effect. Its refugee crisis, more than 5 million or so pouring into European countries, it is my view that that has helped radicalize, one of the things that has helped radicalize politics in a number of European countries. I would dare say you would not have had Brexit without the fact that every single day, the first thing you were seeing if you were in Europe, traveling at any point during that time, was the throngs of people crossing into the different borders and the lengths they were going to in order to flee a nightmare situation. That has had a psychological impact, and I just know from relatives and friends I have in Western European countries, I don't think that that part of the story is really well understood in Washington. Be that as it may, moving forward, I have talked about, and we had my colleague Adam Kinzinger here a moment ago. He and I have both talked about, as co-founders and co-chairs of our Syria caucus, the idea of still doing no-fly zones, roughly analogous to what we did in the 1990s with Iraq, which, oh, by the way, succeeded. Not looking back and saying, well, if we had done it back then, back in 2011, as some people we now know argued at the time, if we were to at least do that now, maybe around Idlib, what would that look like? Is it practical? The risk of inadvertently escalating things, specifically with Russia, you certainly run the risk there of a conflict on the ground that otherwise wouldn't have existed, back in Iraq in the 90s. So please explore for me to what extent you believe that this is a feasible option today and moving forward. Any one of you?
Well, thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I agree with you that there's still potential to accomplish this objective. If you look at a map of Syria, we've essentially created a de facto no-fly zone or no-strike zone in our area of control, the deconfliction zone. That includes northern and eastern Syria, and that includes the Tanaf zone in the Syrian desert near Jordan's border. The Turks have also accomplished that objective in the Euphrates Shield Zone and in Afrin, and could potentially extend that to Idlib, depending on how that agreement takes place. Assuming that the United States and Turkey can come to a modus vivendi together, you would have a zone stretching from the deserts of Deir ez-Zor to the highlands of Latakia, from southeastern Syria to northwestern Syria, that would encompass more than half of the country. And that would be a large space with which to protect Syrian civilians for a long time.
I certainly am sympathetic to the desire to create a no-fly zone over Idlib. I think the complexity lies in the Russian presence in particular. I mean, as we know, when Russia entered the Syrian war in the fall of 2015, that was truly a watershed event that in my view, turned the tide of the war in favor of the regime. I think that Russia's control of the skies in that area would make it a very precarious endeavor. And so I think what might be important is to, in fact, look at the current demilitarized zone, look at the current ceasefire, and really bolster our efforts, perhaps together with Turkey, to ensure that that diplomacy ultimately succeeds. Again, I realize the odds are long. But in my own view, and I'm not a military strategist, I think that the obstacles and the complexities of establishing a no-fly zone over Idlib, however important or desirable that would be, I think are quite difficult. The other issue, of course, is we have to remember.
Let me just interject and say, obviously, if we were going to do it, it sure as heck would have been a lot easier before suddenly Russia arrived on the scene.
Right. Exactly. So that shifted dynamics. And then, of course, as we know, because of the successive, in quotation marks, reconciliation agreements that have been negotiated with the Assad regime, there are a number of more hardline extremists who now have all sort of been shoved up into Idlib. Special Envoy McGurk has said that it is the largest al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. So there is actually a real challenge and a real issue in the province with respect to extremist elements that poses yet another challenge, I think, to U.S. interests.
The gentleman's time has expired, but the gentleman is recognized for the purpose of offering something.
I appreciate his indulgence. I thank the witnesses for their answers. This says Madam Chairman, but let me say, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from 25 international jurists regarding the legal obligations of multilateral and donor countries for reconstruction in Syria, reflecting principles of international humanitarian law, human rights law, and international criminal law. This document has also been submitted to the UN, EU, and World Bank.
Without objection, so ordered. And the gentleman's time has expired, and the chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes. And we thank Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen for holding this important hearing. I want to thank the witnesses. And as a longtime and senior member of the full Foreign Affairs Committee and a past chair of this committee, I would note that I have followed this issue from the very beginning, and many have spoke out on both sides of the aisle, and unfortunately, this travesty, this horrific ongoing saga continued, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people perished as a result, which is, it's a travesty, it really is. Let me say, with the help of Moscow and Tehran, Assad has now regained most of the territory west of the Euphrates. We know he set his sights on retaking Idlib, and right now Russia and Turkey have agreed to a tenuous ceasefire, but this could easily collapse, as many others have in the past, unfortunately. And if it does, there's no question that we're going to see a catastrophic humanitarian crisis as millions of Syrians flee Assad's brutality. We all hope that a peaceful solution, peaceful resolution of this part of the conflict can be reached, and I think we also urge the administration to continue to work to ensure that Assad does not carry out this plan to attack Idlib, which would result in so many lives being lost. There also remains other significant challenges to our interests. Most notably, Iran continues to extend its influence and develop a permanent presence in Syria. This threatens our closest ally in the region, Israel, and will remain an enduring problem for the foreseeable future. And I want to thank the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Don't get to thank the Senate too often, but I'd like to thank them for passing the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act. Assad is a butcher, and this legislation could help us to stop him from killing even more of his own people. So I want to commend the Senate for that. Now to a couple of questions, and I would welcome any of the panel to respond. The demilitarized zone announced by Turkey and Russia in Idlib last week, for the time being, forestalled, as I mentioned before, the likely severe humanitarian crisis that many were expecting. What's the likelihood that the agreement will hold? And considering all the complexities of this war, the civil war, and war in general, how should we respond if it doesn't? And Mrs. Gadar, maybe I'll go to you since you didn't make it into that last round. We ran out of time, so I'll go to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Today we know that this agreement has gave a breather, right? Like, it's not finalized. The Turkey has only 1 month, today less than a month, in order to implement the conditions, in order to create the space. But we all know that Russia might take the opportunity to go back to strike if Turkey didn't have enough time to do this, if there it has difficulties, especially that there are a lot of radical groups who did not agree to move or to the agreement. So this is going to be very complicated. It's not going to be easy for Turkey to do that. And we all know that the Iranian troops that have moved closer to Iblis, they did not leave. So they're still preparing for the battle. This might actually happen. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of lessons learned, actually, that when we talked before about the no-fly zone, it's not the only solution. There are a lot of things that can be done, a lot of things that the U.S. can do in order to respond to such a thing. A lot of these the people in Idlib, if we were worried about humanitarian crisis, a lot of these people actually are not from Idlib. They are from different parts of Syria. They need to go back home, and this is what I talked about the demographic changes. You can avoid a big humanitarian crisis if actually facilitated the return of these refugees from Idlib to their hometowns around Damascus and Hamas and other places where Hezbollah does not want them to go. And also there are different things, like, for example, I give you the example of South Syria, Southwest Syria, where another agreement was made between Jordan and Russia. This agreement allowed Assad forces to go in, right, and control the borders and enclose over the Golan Heights. And today that's a problem, because if you don't have a third party who actually manages the conditions and make sure that this agreement is implemented, a third party that can be from not the local actors that made the agreement, it's not going to work, because today we have the Assad regime in southeast Syria, very close to the Golan Heights and Jordan border, and it's so easy for Iran to infiltrate Assad army. So today we are making the war between Iran and Israel more possible than ever. So this is something that we need to consider also when looking at Idlib, not to make the same mistakes.
Very good. Thank you very much. My time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I want to pick up exactly where you just left off, Ms. Gada, because you said, I'm going to quote, "We're making the war between Israel and Iran more possible every day." And that's a great concern. There's so many issues we need to talk about within the context of the war in Syria, but I want to focus on this one. And as been stated before, U.S. presence is exclusively in the northeastern part of Syria. It's north and east of the Euphrates River. Iranian presence is south and west. There's separation between the U.S. and Iran. Again, as it was said earlier, Iran's focus is on the Alawite coast, connecting with Lebanon, and then the corridor linking to Iran to the Mediterranean, that land bridge, and the Iraqi border, correct, and then through Iraq. And Iran's presence in Syria is becoming increasingly permanent. It's the integration into the military. It's the establishment of permanent bases. And perhaps of greatest concern is the development of indigenous missile manufacturing capability that allows, again, as stated earlier, for Iran to sustain a targeted, aggressive, expansive missile attack against Israel from two fronts, both in Lebanon and in Syria. Israel can defend herself, and it's necessary that we always ensure that Israel has the strategic advantage, the qualitative military edge to do so. But there are risks as time goes on. We talked about the incident that happened outside Latakia, but now Russia's threatening to install the S-300s, which increases the risk to Israel's necessary actions to defend herself against Iran. All of that's lead up to three questions I'll throw out to the panel. One, what are the long-term risks for the United States, and in particular our ally Israel, of not changing the dynamic in southwestern Syria? Two, what is the leverage we have over Iran now, and what should we be working towards in the future to try to achieve that? And three, it was mentioned in your testimony that there's disillusionment within Lebanon with respect to Hezbollah. How might the United States work with Israel, work on our own to increase, how can Congress work to increase and exploit that disillusionment with Hezbollah to try to get some strategic leverage? And I will leave it to you to answer.
I've gone into a lot of details in my written testimony, so just to be brief, because we're short on time and to allow my colleagues also to answer, I'll just take the Lebanon question and leave the rest to them. The discontent among the Shia community is huge. I've never seen the Shia community in Lebanon divided as it is today, and that's because of Hezbollah's regional role, growing Hezbollah's regional role. And I think the best way to do it is to compete with Hezbollah where they're weak, compete with Iran in general where they're weak. And today their weakness is financial. Today their weakness is not being able to provide services, and that's why when I talk about an alternative in Lebanon, an alternative for the Shia in general, it has to be economic. It has to be about jobs, it's about livelihoods, and this is where Hezbollah cannot function today. I think my colleagues have more to say about the rest, so the rest is all in my testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. I would say that as our policy stands now, we're allowing Russia essentially to be the referee between Israel and Iran and Syria, which is a dangerous path to be on. Israel and Iran are, in effect, at war in Syria. Over the last year, Israel has conducted, by their own estimate, approximately 200 strikes inside Syria, and it's likely to increase. The challenge in the Southwest is we had the opportunity this summer to enforce the Southwest de-escalation zone, and we passed on that opportunity. The armed opposition, some of whom that we had supported for the better part of half a decade, is now under Assad and are under reconciliation deals, as has been mentioned. We have very little leverage left in western Syria, except potentially in Idlib, where there is a witch's brew of armed opposition groups, including extremist groups, that we have to get rid of first before we can actually make that actionable.
Mr. Kupian.
Very quickly, my comment would really basically roll up what both Haneen and Nick have said, which is to say focus on where we are in the East. I do believe that Iran is fairly well entrenched in the West, and that might even be an area that we need further study on, the degree to which they're actually integrating into the Syrian military and security apparatus. How entangled are they? That for me is an open question and an important one. But I think in the East, our presence in the East is a very important bulwark against further Iranian expansion. And I don't just mean the military presence. I actually think even more important is the non-kinetic activities we are undertaking on the ground in Syria, the stabilization work, the work on governance, on restoring essential services, on providing, frankly, hope for the Syrians that are living there. In some ways, it mirrors or it shadows what Haneen is saying is the most effective way of responding in Lebanon. So too, I think, in eastern Syria, providing hope, providing another source of livelihoods, governance, et cetera, is, I think, in many ways the most effective and perhaps sustainable counterweight to the expansion of Iranian influence. Thank you.
Thank you. My time has expired. I will close with one last thought. This committee has taken action, for example, with Hezbollah, the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act and the subsequent that passed last week, extensions or expansion of that. There's more we can do. We've stayed focused with the Caesar Act, and I hope that this committee will continue to stay focused on this issue in specific vis-a-vis Israel and Iran, but also more broadly into the crisis in Syria. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you so much, and we all hope that as well. Thank you, Mr. Schneider. And now very pleased to yield to Mr. Curtis of Utah.
Thank you very much, and thanks to our witnesses for being here. I'm thinking about refugees as much as the world is. As everybody knows, this is a situation the world, many countries are struggling to figure out how to deal with this. Is there a scenario, and at what level can we hope for seeing these refugees return to Syria, and what would we need to see before that was possible?
Very quickly, Assad has to go. If Assad stays in power, the refugees will be forced to join his army upon their return. They will be forced to go to places where lose their hometowns, lose their land. The demographic changes are going to increase. The only way to stabilize the situation for the refugees to come back without feeling the fear of being persecuted by Assad again is Assad has to go. We have to start here, and then there are a lot of things that can be done afterwards, but I think that's the only way.
I would just build on what Haneen said, that Russia has weaponized refugee flows. The refugee flows from Syria have increased since Russia intervened militarily in September 2015. Russia is using refugees as a pressure point, particularly on the European Union, to try to renormalize Assad. And to build off a point that was made by Mona, the demilitarized zone was successful in part because the administration had made it very clear to Russia that if it continued with an offensive against Idlib, it could kiss any type of pathway to reconstruction assistance goodbye, and that is a lever point on the Russians.
And I would concur with what both my colleagues have said. I would just add maybe 2 points. One is, I think Syrian refugees themselves say they are not comfortable returning, or at least many of them that I've talked to, they're not comfortable returning with Assad still there. I think we have to keep our eye on the issue of forced returns. This was mentioned earlier with respect to Lebanon. As the conflict continues, and as I've said, it's in its 8th year, we are seeing growing fatigue in refugee-hosting communities in neighboring countries and growing pressures to force refugees back into Syria prematurely. This is something I think we need to keep an eye on. And finally, given the magnitude of the challenge, we also need to think about the prospect of a lost generation of Syrian children and difficulties with access to education, particularly amongst Syrian refugees and also inside Syria. This is an issue, I think, that has not only moral implications, but actually long-term security and strategic implications for the United States. So I would urge us to consider and think about ways to provide assistance that address some of these issues, education in particular.
Thank you. Very thoughtful responses. A lot of us around the world question how and when to respond to Syria's particular use of chemical weapons. I'm curious what level of violence or civilian casualties do you believe would be necessary to trigger a U.S. military response should the U.S. launch airstrikes against Syria if chemical weapons are not used?
The Assad regime has killed a lot of Syrians, less than half with chemical weapons, more with regular traditional weapons. I think the military response should have been done before. For 500,000 deaths is a lot of, it's a big number, but it's not just Assad. We have the Iranians as well. We have Hezbollah, the Shia militias. All of these guys have been killing civilians and causing a refugee crisis, and the Russians as well. So last time there was a military response by the US, it targeted Assad's facilities, and I think drawing a clearer line in the sand against Iranians in Syria is also very important by not avoiding a confrontation with Iran, a military confrontation. I think Iranians do not want the confrontation much more than anyone else, and they will try to avoid confrontation. A clear line in the sand when it comes to Iran is also very important.
I would just say that as it stands now in the Syrian civil war, the only way for the U.S. to actually have leverage on the behavior of Assad and his allies is to set a clear message that any type of future offensive against opposition-controlled areas would necessitate a response. Otherwise, there is no pathway for a successful U.S. strategy in Syria.
Regardless of chemical weapons or not? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Very briefly, because of time, I mean, what I outline in my testimony is essentially the notion that, as I've said, we have seen this regime transgress all laws of armed conflict, and in particular, though, I think most egregiously the use of chemical weapons. I think this poses a real challenge for the United States in terms of developing doctrine that finds, as I put it in, I don't think I use the exact term, but the sweet spot, if you will, for the use of force, how to use force in a way to effectively deter the Assad regime from committing further atrocities, but in a way that does not force Syria into deeper, it doesn't escalate the conflict in ways that, again, also do not redound to the benefit of Syrian civilians. I'm not sure that we have figured that out yet. What does that use of force look like?
Yes, thank you. Unfortunately, I'm out of time. Appreciate that, and I yield my time, Madam Chair.
So much. We value your service on our committee, Mr. Curtis. Thank you. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here. Your fresh faces to our committee. I hope that it's the beginning of many other appearances that you will make on this most pressing humanitarian disaster that is unfolding before our eyes, and we feel powerless. And that's a bad feeling for the greatest country in the world to be feeling. So thank you for excellent testimony. Look forward to hearing from you again. Thank you. And with that,
thank you very much.
The subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to the audience, too.